So here we are, seconds from disaster. That dreaded moment when we realize that a security incident has already happened. And the problem now is, what do we do? Who does what? And how do we react in the best way possible so that we can also stop the attack from continuing, we can also isolate the affected systems, and then we can also learn something from what just happened in order to avoid it in the future. Now, the CySA exam doesn't really require you to go too much in depth in these incident response procedures. This is more likely adequate to the CySA certification and exam, but on a high level note, you need to understand what is going on, what are the necessary roles, what are the necessary actions and steps to be taken whenever a security incident happens. So incident response as a process, it's actually a procedure that needs to be followed whenever a bad thing happens, whenever a security incident happens. And just like with any procedure that needs to be followed in moments of high level of stress and critical moments, it does need some really clear instructions and really clear steps to be taken so that everybody knows exactly what they need to do, what are we doing right now, and what's the end game, what's the target, what are we after. And one of these structured documents has been published for a while by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and it can be found for free on the internet as Special Publication 800-61. Officially, this one is called Computer Security Incident Handling Guide. And this document does outline some major steps when dealing with incident response. Starting with preparation, which is not actually part of the incident response itself, because this is something that it should happen long before the security incident has happened. So preparation means making sure that your networks, your systems, even your people are secure. So you're taking all the necessary steps in order to increase your security posture so that when an incident hits, its impact is going to be as low as possible. It also implies that you need to train your users so that everybody knows what to do. You also need to train your users in order to avoid potential security incidents, and also testing of existing security response and incident response procedures is part of the preparation phase. So it's not just enough to have them in place, you have to make sure that everybody is aware of them and that they are up to date. Next in line comes the identification of the incident, because a security incident is only a security incident if it affects in some way the security posture of a system or of a company as a whole. There are a lot of incidents out there which are not security incidents. So it all starts with a report. It starts with a complaint, perhaps, reported to the IT department by a regular user. It can start by identifying an alert generated by one of your devices. And this is where everything starts. This is a sort of a triage phase where we analyze what happened and then we decide, is this a security incident or not? And if it is, then we're going to start notifying the right people and taking the right steps. Like, for example, taking steps to contain that security incident. Make sure it doesn't affect more than it already has. So if you're facing malware that is spreading over the network, make sure that you isolate somehow the affected workstations. You could do this at layer 2 using VLANs. You could do this at layer 3 using routing. You could do this simply by disconnecting network cables. Sometimes disconnecting network cables, even though it's extremely efficient, might not be the best idea whenever an attack is ongoing. Because if it's an ongoing attack, then it means that there is a live connection between some compromised hosts in your network and an attacker's workstation somewhere outside or even inside a company. You should be able to identify this connection and to be able to figure out who is at the end of it and perhaps what are their intentions. If you just start disconnecting everything and unplugging all the network and perhaps even the power cables, you're pretty much left in the dark. You don't know what happened, and there's no way for you to find out how to protect against that incident in the future. Once containment has been successfully implemented, of course, eradication has to take place. That is, eliminating the malicious effects of that data breach, of that attack, of that security incident from your network. Part of the elimination process might be required to re-image, reinstall operating systems or reconfigure devices that have been affected. And of course, this reconfiguration and reinstallation should be augmented by an update of your security policies, an update of the affected software. So make sure you're patching everything. perhaps you've just ignored for some time some security updates, and that's exactly what exposed you to a potential attack. And erasing all the traces of malware might prove difficult sometimes. This is why you might have to rely on some processes such as secure erase, where you simply completely erase anything that can store data inside of a system, including disks and SSDs and caches and everything else that can store data, or disk sanitization. In the recovery phase, we're trying to come back to the functional state that we had before the attack happened. That is, we're trying to bring back the affected systems into production. Now, if we had to clean up after the actual attack, then those systems might require a restore from a backup or a rebuild of their functionality or a reconfiguration of their functionality. And finally, lessons learned. It's very important to understand what happened, to document what happened, so that somebody else along the line in the future is going to be able to avoid the same type of incident. It also pays to understand where were the flaws that actually allowed this incident to happen. And it's not just a game of pointing fingers here and throwing blame. It's about figuring out where your weaknesses are in order to fix them as soon as possible. As part of the response coordination, a lot of departments are going to be involved in a security incident, especially because most departments are going to be affected by that security incident, but there are different levels at which each and every one of them becomes involved in this process, starting with senior leadership. Even though they might not understand exactly what happened at a technical level and why that security incident got to happen in the first place, they are still the number one decision point. So whenever we need to make a big decision, such as, I don't know, disconnect the entire data center from the internet, or isolate the affected systems, or notify the affected parties that have been affected by the data breach that we just faced, everything that requires high-level decisions needs to involve senior leadership. Legal team can also have something to say here, because more often than not, these data breaches, especially if they are accompanied by the loss of confidential information, personally identifiable information, financial health information, there are going to be legal consequences following that data breach. Also, depending on the local legislation, you might have to notify affected parties as soon as possible about your data breach. So don't keep it hush, don't keep it under the rug, because at some point everybody's going to know about it, and the sooner the better. The IT and networking teams are definitely going to be involved, because those are going to be the ones that actually implement those decisions taken by senior leadership. Now, these are the people that are going to, first of all, try to contain the incident. Then they're the ones that eradicate any traces of the malware or any artifacts left over by the security incident. And they're also the ones that are going to have to put those affected systems back into production. Also, HR is going to be involved whenever the author of the attack or of the data breach is proven to be an insider threat. So it's one of your colleagues. Tough luck. And marketing or public relations. This department is going to have a pretty bad day when tasked with informing the affected clients, the public, the market, the news websites. They're going to take care of publishing an official message about what happened, and they'd better do it before the press finds out about the fact that you've just gotten breached. Also, if a data breach affects in some way the trustworthiness of your company, your reputation, again, marketing and PR are going to have a lot of work to do in taking care of your reputation in front of your customers. As far as communication goes, during an incident response situation, that's going to be critical. Communication is key in many places in life, but also especially during an incident response phase. So communication is going to start with the Computer Security Incident Response Team. Those are the people specially trained to know exactly what to do in case of a security incident is going to happen. So they are going to be the ones that actually work as a single point of contact. So whoever needs to interact with the team that takes care of the incident response is going to actually interact with the CSIRT. Now, they are also going to be the ones that report back to senior management and to affected parties what is the current status and how bad the data breach actually was. As far as communication goes, internally, between internal teams, out-of-band communication is recommended. That is because when you don't know exactly the extent of a security breach or of a security incident, perhaps the internal communication channels that you are normally using, like email, like instant messaging, like some collaboration software you might have in your company, those might be compromised. And for once, it means that those communication methods might not be trustworthy anymore. And second, if the attacker has managed to compromise those communication channels, then you might be informing the attacker by using them. You might be informing the attacker as to what is the development of the incident response process. And you don't want to give away your defenses. You don't want to tell the attacker what you're about to do before you're actually doing it, especially if the attack is still ongoing. Another reason why your normal communication channels might be compromised is because you don't know exactly if the threat, if the attacker that is the author of the data breach is an outsider or an insider. If it's an insider, then the risk is much higher for that person to have compromised some internal communication application that you're using in your company. What I mean by out-of-band communication here could be anything. I mean, you could just fall back to instant messaging over your mobile phones like WhatsApp or Telegram or iMessage or whatever you have at your disposal that is not part of the network that has just been breached. And stakeholder involvement, of course, this is also part of a communication plan. Just like we said a couple of minutes ago, you need to notify all the affected parties. Your business partners, your customers, other branches perhaps might have been affected. They need to know about this as soon as possible. And also you need to control how this communication is going to flow. You don't want people to find out about your breach before you get a chance to actually communicate what happened in an informed and coherent manner. So officially, you should have something called an incident response plan. Now, this could be a document or multiple documents developed by the team dealing with security incidents, and it might also be custom tailored depending on the type of incident. So you might have a specific incident response plan for a data breach, you might have one for a denial of service attack, you might have one for a natural disaster perhaps. So you might have different response plans according to the type of incident that you are facing. The actual list of steps to be taken has the name of a standard operating procedure, an SOP. Sometimes it's called a playbook, sometimes it's called a run book. It's just a list of steps to be taken so that when everybody is so stressed and people are running around aimlessly, not knowing what to do, there is a document somewhere, hopefully you know where it is, that is going to help you identify what exactly are the next steps and who is responsible for what. And the incident response plan not only includes the necessary steps to be taken, it also mentions the people responsible for taking those steps, and it also mentions any available resources that you might have at your disposal. Not financial resources necessarily, but IT resources, perhaps. And selecting those resources or allocating those resources in an efficient manner, depending on the type of incident, requires you to first classify the incident. And the incident is most likely going to be as bad as the value of the resources affected by it. So we can assess the affected resources by a number of factors. For example, by the value of the data being held by those systems or by the value of the data that was just part of a data breach. Another prioritization factor might be if the affected systems imply some sort of downtime. So is the attack going to affect the availability of our systems, or is it just going to affect the performance of some systems, or is it going to simply put down the entire business? Another decision factor is how visible is this incident going to be from the outside? In other words, the optics of the incident. Bad publicity, right? So how is this going to be received by the media, by the customers, by our clients? How bad is this going to affect our reputation? The scope generally means the number of affected systems. How large of a data breach are we talking about? How many systems have been affected? Because depending on the number of the systems and the types of the systems, it's going to require more or less effort for recovery and to bring them back into a working state. Time to detection. This is an interesting one. What exactly do we mean by this? Well, the idea here is that in many cases, real successful data breaches and real successful attacks on companies that are aimed to steal some data, to introduce some backdoors or some vulnerabilities in some code. Those attacks sometimes go unnoticed. And I don't mean go unnoticed until the next business day. They might go unnoticed for months. So you might be in a security incident without even knowing about it. You might discover at some point a backdoor in one of your servers that has been there for a year. If you discover something like this, it's obviously going to become sky-high priority to fix that one in front of any other security breach that you might be detecting at the same time. Recovery time is also an important factor when deciding where to allocate resources. You might have some systems that you can easily just replace or bring back into working state, or you might have some systems that are going to take days or weeks before they become usable again. And of course, during that time, ask yourself, is the business going to be able to function without those systems? Or am I going to be facing even more attacks, or even I'm going to expose myself with even more vulnerabilities due to the fact that I'm unable to use those systems that perhaps were even involved in the protection of our network? Now, over time, there have been introduced many methods for describing the stages of an attack. These descriptive stages have been introduced in order to better try to understand at which stage we currently are in an attack, what we can do at that stage, or what is the end purpose of an attack that has just been detected. And many people have tried to abstract these in some papers, in some frameworks, in order to create some sort of a theoretical model that should match pretty much all attacks out there. Now, the degree to which they've managed to create a valid model is up for discussion, of course, but we do have a couple of models that are worth mentioning because they're pretty close to real life. For example, Lockheed Martin Corporation defines something called the cyber kill chain or the intrusion kill chain in this white paper right here. Now, this kill chain defines the phases for common attacks, but applies mainly to those conducted by APT groups, advanced persistent threats. Now, the same document also talks in details about IOCs, indicators of compromise, methods to mitigate those attacks, reconstructing attacks after they already happened, and some details about campaign analysis. That is to determine whether the attack is part of a larger campaign that targets multiple individuals or multiple companies, or is it something that is strongly focused on your single company, so it's a very targeted type of an attack. And the best way to view this in a graphical manner, no less, is by visiting the actual website of Lockheed Martin. That's a little cyber kill chain right here. You can see it's focused on APT threats. A stands for advanced, means targeted, coordinated, purposeful. Persistent, it's a type of an attack that can last for weeks, for months. So it's a type of an attack that opens up a communication channel for long-term interaction between the attacker and the victim, and a threat, which is the actual person or the entity that has intent, opportunity, and the capability to conduct this attack. The phases, defined by Lockheed Martin, start with reconnaissance. With reconnaissance, we're talking about an attacker who is trying to gather as much information as possible about their potential victims. It might be using open source intelligence, it might be using active reconnaissance tools like active scanning, trying to hit the firewalls, trying to hit the email service, trying to hit any publicly available services just to see if there are any weaknesses in there and try to discover as much as possible about the internal structure, internal design of that network. Next comes the weaponization phase. And with weaponization, we are coupling or connecting a specific exploit with a specific vulnerability. So once we have found a vulnerability that we can exploit, we're choosing an exploit for it, and we're wrapping it up and ready to be delivered to the victim system, which actually happens in the delivery phase. With delivery phase, we are tricking the victim into either sticking a USB stick into their computer, clicking a link, downloading some piece of malware, installing some sort of a backdoor. We could be using social engineering here. We could be using other advanced tools in order to gain a foothold and to deliver that malicious payload to the victim's computer. Finally, we've got exploitation. So assuming that the victim has managed to introduce that malware into the network or into the system, that's when the malware starts exploiting a specific vulnerability by installing a backdoor, by propagating to different systems, or by simply acting on objectives, as in trying to steal the data that we were after, or trying to perform a denial of service attack. Installation of malware is a phase that is relevant whenever the attack requires to be persistent. So we need to make sure, as an attacker, we need to make sure that we can connect to that compromised workstation anytime we want in the future. So we can send it commands and make it do our bidding. Command and control phase, that's basically the control channel between the compromised host and the attacker's workstation. This is the channel through which the attacker is going to keep providing commands and querying that compromised host as to its health in order to make it do whatever the attacker intends to do. In other words, manipulation of the victim. And finally, actions and objectives, that is, whatever the attacker intended to do in the first place. Did it want to steal some data? Did it want to compromise some data? Maybe perform a denial of service attack? Or maybe, just maybe, the initial purpose was to gain access, to gain control of as many systems as possible so that in the future, those compromised hosts might be used in a coordinated attack. So remember this one. Remember these phases. More than likely, you're going to be asked on the exam day about the cyber kill chain. Another way to describe attacks, and this one, I actually prefer this one personally, is from Mitre, and it's called the attack framework. And yes, it is written ATT&CK. It's the attack framework, in which it's actually not just a theoretical model, but it's actually a kind of a database. It's an attack matrix for enterprise. You can see it right here. It's kind of a database of observed and known and documented attacks. Let me show you how this works. This right here is the Mitre attack framework. As you can see, it is divided in a couple of columns in here, and all of these basically describe different types of attacks. Now, the entire list here is actually much larger. I just couldn't fit it on a single screen here. So you can see we have different example of attack methods regarding gaining initial access, or privilege escalation, or credential access, or lateral movement, command and control, data exfiltration, and so on and so forth. And all of these, underneath each one of these, we're going to find a lot of examples documented from real-world situations. So for example, under credential access, I'm going to find here brute force, right? Along with forged web credentials, authentication process modification, intercepting multi-factor authentication, or pretty much anything that was ever hacked in the world belongs to some sort of a category in this Mitre attack framework. Let's just see a couple of examples here in the brute force section. So if we click on brute force, first of all, we're going to see a couple of sub-techniques in here. There you go, password guessing, cracking, spraying, and stuffing. And finally, we're going to see a couple of examples here. So under procedure examples, you're going to find some IDs in here with some names. These are the actual name of the malware or of the APT group that was identified as an author that performs brute force in an organized manner in order to gain access to credentials. There you go. So many examples in here observed over time on major malware out there that was specifically designed to brute force authentication credentials. You can also see a couple of mitigation techniques. So this also works as a database of what to be on the lookout for and how to protect yourself, right? Much better than that simple cyber kill chain. This one is actually useful. And methods for detection. How do you detect brute force? So I will let you play with this one for just a bit. It's available at attack.mitre.org. It's freely available, and it's a priceless source of information regarding everything that is hackable in this world. So don't ignore this. Don't ignore this for the exam, and don't ignore it for your general knowledge. I would strongly recommend to have a look over this attack framework. Don't learn it by heart, of course, but try to understand different types of techniques presented here. It's probably the single most comprehensive collection of information about cyber attacks, and it's a great learning tool for discovering and understanding how cyber attacks look nowadays. And this entire database is based on real observations. So everything that you see in here is not just theory, but has been observed, has been documented, and used as an attack technique at least once in real life. Next up, we have the diamond model of intrusion analysis. Now, personally, this is not one of my favorites because it can prove to be a bit hard to follow, and also because it's a bit limited and only focuses on a single intrusion event. Now, what we see here in this diamond model is actually an intrusion event described by the relationships between four core features of that event. We have the adversary, we have the capabilities of the adversary, we have a victim, and we have the infrastructure that makes the attack possible. And the lines in this model are the relationships between these concepts. And they tell us that it's possible for an analyst to reach the other connected points given enough information. So for example, if we analyze a victim, we can see the capabilities used by the attacker against that victim, so we can see how the victim was attacked. If we have infrastructure visibility over the network or of the logs, for example, then we draw even more conclusions about how the capability used the infrastructure to compromise the victim. So as an example here, we could say that a connection between the victim and an attacker's capability is the fact that the victim was able to discover a piece of malware on the system. Now, that malware used the infrastructure because it actually pointed to a malicious domain. It might have been a malware that tried to contact a command and control entity on the internet. All right, so that's a connection between the capability, being the malware, and the infrastructure that is available to it. That's the internet and the local network. Next up, we have the domain, part of the infrastructure that points to an IP address. So we, as a security analyst, now we can identify a specific IP address pointing to that source of malware. By looking at the network logs, that is the connection between the infrastructure and the victim, we could potentially identify multiple victims in the same network. We could potentially identify multiple workstations that are now part of a botnet that have been infected by the same malware, simply by looking at the logs and the affected workstations. That's a connection between the infrastructure and the victims. And finally, by analyzing the IP address pointing that command and control, we are able to pinpoint the location of the adversary. Now, we might not know exactly their name and date of birth, but we know that the IP address that we detected is the root of all evil. So that's one domain that should be probably blacklisted, and all traffic should be filtered whenever other workstations, perhaps infected workstations, will attempt to communicate over that command and control channel. And, well, after discussing the cyber kill chain, after discussing the Mitre attack framework, this kind of sounds very oversimplified, right? Kind of too easy to be true, too easy to be useful. It actually does include a bit more information. That information is considered a meta feature of the diamond model. I know all this terminology here kind of doesn't help. It looks like it attempts to overcomplicate things. I've already said that I don't like this model, but bear with me here for one more minute. Now, as part of these meta features, we could add another set of details to this event, such as, for example, an event timestamp. When did the event happen, the security event happen? In which phase was the event in? Was it during reconnaissance? Was it during weaponization? And so on. A result. Was the event successful or not? Did it compromise any part of confidentiality, integrity, and availability? Was it just a failed attempt? A direction. Was it initiated by the victim? So somebody tricked the victim into installing malware by themselves, or it came from the outside, or was it somehow bidirectional? A method. What exactly was the attack? Was it phishing? Was it an exploit? Was it a malicious link? Was it a cross-site scripting? Was it a denial of service attack? Depending on the type of the attack. And finally, the resources required to complete the event, like reconnaissance information that might have been required, password hashes that the attacker might have gained in the meantime, the presence of a vulnerability that's high on the list probably, anything that the attacker needs to assume or gather before conducting the attack. And all of these features then are being assigned a confidence level, which of course is based on an assumption. Well, incident response planning looks good on paper, but you have to make sure periodically that the people can actually put it into practice, that they can apply it whenever shit hits the fan. So, testing your incident response plan requires you to perform a set of exercises. Now, these exercises, depending on how much money and time you have at your disposal, might range from something as simple as a tabletop exercise, which is kind of similar to a board game. Just by using a couple of flashcards, just by using a theoretical scenario, people just gather together and discuss. So if this happens, this is what I would do. This is what you would do. This is what we all do. And we all laugh and then go to lunch. Not very efficient, but it's better than nothing. Next up, we would have a walkthrough. Now, a walkthrough is very similar to a tabletop exercise, but it requires the participants to actually demonstrate their skills. like performing a scan, analyzing a piece of malware, playing with some isolated environments that would simulate somehow the environment that has been breached. In general, all these environments are just sandboxes or just virtual machines that are there for testing purposes. So it's a kind of a tabletop exercise, but with a bit more hands-on practice. Finally, we have simulations. Now, with a simulation, this requires a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of involvement. In a simulation, we actually divide people into two teams. We have the red team that simulates the attack. We have the blue team that simulates the defense team, right? And we also have a white team that works as some sort of a control or arbiter of the entire game. Right, we are simulating a real attack, perhaps on a limited set of resources, perhaps on a test environment, but we are actually attacking those resources, right? So blue team and red team, of course, they're both part of the same company, but they have to learn to play together and to learn from this exercise how to better protect against somebody who doesn't do this for fun. Now, you shouldn't confuse incident response with the generic term of business continuity. The incident response is just focused on a security incident. Now, on the other hand, we also have a couple of different approaches to different types of incidents that might happen to our building, to our business, to our systems, IT systems. So, for example, we have a disaster recovery plan, which can be considered a special type of incident where the entire business is affected. It might be a natural disaster, it might be due to a war, to a civil unrest. Regardless of the reason, usually a disaster recovery plan is going to include all the necessary resources and instructions for relocating the entire business to some other secondary site. Business continuity planning, on the other hand, is a document or a procedure that instructs how to be able to keep the business going even in a situation where the entire business is affected by a disaster or by a security incident. So, for example, if a server or an IT resource is made unusable due to one of these incidents above, then the business continuity plan should provide some sort of an alternative or methods for providing some sort of a failover onto a secondary system that can still keep the business going. And finally, continuity of operations plan. This is a type of plan that is mostly associated with government facilities. And by its definition, it refers to a situation in which the entire organization needs a backup plan to work without any kind of IT support. So that's continuity of operations plan, also written in a shorthand notation as COOP. So those are the phases of incident response and a very, very high-level overview of the people and the resources and the steps involved in dealing with a security incident. Now, I hope you found this informative and useful. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this, and see you on the next video.